In the quiet town of Havenwood, Oregon, 16-year-old Lily Thompson vanished without a trace during her morning run with her husky Koda. 3 years later, when all hope seemed lost, a helicopter's thermal camera captures something impossible. A heat signature deep in the wilderness that changes everything. What they discover in that hidden cabin will reveal a truth more disturbing than anyone imagined, where the line between victim and willing participant becomes terrifyingly blurred. Before we continue with the story, tell us where you're watching from and how old you are, and subscribe to our channel to receive new stories every day that will thrill your heart. I hope you enjoy the story. The morning mist clung to the streets of Havenwood like a shroud, weaving between the Victorian houses that lined Maple Avenue with their painted shutters and wraparound porches. This small Oregon town, nestled in the shadow of the Cascade Range, had always prided itself on being the kind of place where children could ride their bicycles until dusk, and neighbors knew each other by name. The population of 8,000 souls lived in harmony with the towering Douglas firs that seemed to guard their community from the outside world, their branches swaying gently in the Pacific Northwest breeze. But harmony had been shattered 3 years ago on a crisp October morning when 16-year-old Lily Thompson had laced up her worn running shoes, clipped the leash to her husky's collar, and disappeared into the embrace of the forest trail that bordered the town's eastern edge. The trail, once a beloved path for joggers and dog walkers, had become a wound in the landscape, a reminder of unanswered questions and sleepless nights. Eleanor Thompson sat in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had packed Lily's lunch every school morning for 16 years, her fingers wrapped around a ceramic mug that had long since grown cold. The coffee inside had formed a thin film on its surface, but Eleanor barely noticed. Her gray-green eyes, once vibrant with laughter, now held the hollow quality of someone who had stared too long into an abyss. The morning light filtered through the gingham curtains she had sewn herself, casting dancing shadows across the oak table where Lily's abandoned calculus homework still lay beneath a stack of missing person flyers. The house itself seemed to hold its breath in Eleanor's presence. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with mechanical precision, each second marking another moment of uncertainty. Family photographs lined the mantelpiece above the fireplace, chronicling Lily's journey from a gap-toothed 7-year-old holding her first-place science fair ribbon to a confident teenager with her arm around Koda at last year's Havenwood Harvest Festival. In every image, Lily's dark hair caught the light like spun silk, and her smile radiated the kind of infectious joy that made strangers pause on the street. Eleanor's fingers traced the rim of her mug as her gaze drifted to the coat rack by the front door. There, hanging like a ghost of normalcy, was Lily's navy blue windbreaker. The fabric was slightly faded from countless wash cycles, and the left pocket bore a small tear from when Koda had been a puppy, all teeth and boundless energy. Eleanor had repaired that tear with careful stitches, the same way she had mended scraped knees and broken hearts throughout Lily's childhood. Now, she couldn't bring herself to move the jacket, as if disturbing it might somehow sever the invisible thread connecting her to her daughter. The windbreaker had become Eleanor's talisman, her proof that this nightmare would end with Lily bursting through the front door, breathless from her run, Koda panting at her heels. She would complain about forgetting her jacket, laugh at her own forgetfulness, and ask what was for breakfast. Eleanor had played this scene in her mind thousands of times, each iteration wearing grooves in her consciousness like water-carving stone. Detective James Miller had visited the Thompson house countless times in the months following Lily's disappearance. His weathered face and patient demeanor had become as familiar as the furniture, his presence both comforting and devastating. Miller, a 20-year veteran of the Oregon State Police, had worked missing persons cases before, but something about Lily Thompson's disappearance had burrowed under his skin like a splinter. The investigation had been thorough, almost obsessively so. Search and rescue teams had combed every inch of the Cascade foothills, their orange safety vests moving through the undergrowth like flames. Bloodhounds had followed Lily's scent to the edge of Miller Creek, where it mysteriously vanished as if she had simply evaporated into the morning air. Helicopters had buzzed overhead for weeks, their rotors beating against the silence of the mountains, while volunteers from surrounding towns had formed human chains, calling Lily's name until their voices grew hoarse. The town of Havenwood had rallied around the Thompson family with the fierce loyalty that small communities reserve for their own. The local diner, Murphy's Corner, had become an unofficial command center, its red vinyl booths filled with searchers mapping grid patterns on paper placemats. Sarah Chen, who owned the flower shop on Main Street, had organized meal trains that kept Eleanor's refrigerator stocked with casseroles and sympathy. The high school had dedicated their homecoming dance to Lily, her photograph displayed on every table alongside white roses and flickering candles. But as autumn faded into winter, and winter gave way to spring, the intensity of the search began to wane. The volunteers returned to their own lives, their own families, their own problems. The missing person posters that had once covered every telephone pole and shop window began to curl at the edges, their colors fading under the relentless Oregon rain. The case file on Detective Miller's desk grew thicker, but no more illuminating, filled with dead ends and false leads that led nowhere but back to the beginning. Miller had been forced to make the decision that haunted every detective working cold cases. 3 years after Lily Thompson had vanished, he had quietly moved her file from active to inactive, storing it in the gray metal cabinet that housed Havenwood's unsolved mysteries. The official investigation was over, though Miller still found himself driving past the trailhead on his way home from work, his eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting to see a flash of movement, a sign that the forest was finally ready to give up its secrets. The community's response to the case being shelved had been understanding but painful. Mayor Patricia Wholesome, a woman whose very name seemed designed for small-town politics, had held a brief press conference outside City Hall. She had spoken of resources and priorities, of the need to focus on cases that could still be solved. Her words had been careful, diplomatic, but Eleanor had heard the subtext clearly enough. Havenwood was ready to move on. And move on it had, in the way that communities do when faced with inexplicable tragedy. New families moved into town, drawn by the affordable housing and scenic beauty. Children who had been in elementary school when Lily disappeared were now in high school themselves, creating their own memories and leaving their own impressions on the town's collective consciousness. The Harvest Festival had resumed its normal programming, no longer dedicating moments of silence to the missing girl who had once been crowned Apple Blossom Princess. Eleanor watched this gradual forgetting with a mixture of understanding and rage that she kept carefully contained beneath a facade of dignified grief. She understood that life had to continue, that people couldn't remain frozen in the amber of one terrible moment. But she also felt the weight of being Lily's sole guardian of memory, the only person who still woke each morning expecting to hear footsteps on the stairs. The physical reminders of Lily's presence had taken on an almost sacred quality in Eleanor's mind. The indent in the couch cushion where Lily used to curl up with her textbooks, the strand of dark hair still clinging to her pillowcase, the half-used bottle of vanilla body spray on her dresser that still carried her daughter's scent. Eleanor had transformed these mundane objects into shrines, visiting them with the reverence of a pilgrim. The town's forgetting had begun subtly, a natural erosion of urgency that Eleanor recognized but could not stop. Conversations that once began with updates about the search now moved quickly to safer topics. The cashier at the grocery store, once full of encouraging words and theories, now offered only sympathetic smiles and small talk about the weather. The mailman still delivered Eleanor's pension checks with extra gentleness, but his eyes no longer held the sharp attention of someone expecting news. As Eleanor sat in her kitchen on this particular morning, 3 years and 17 days after her daughter had vanished, she felt the familiar weight of solitude pressing against her chest. The silence of the house had become oppressive, broken only by the settling of old wood and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Outside, Havenwood continued its peaceful existence, smoke rising from chimneys, school buses navigating the familiar routes, the rhythm of ordinary life playing out against the backdrop of the mountains that had swallowed her child whole. The Tuesday morning sky hung heavy with pewter clouds when Forest Service pilot Captain Marcus Reed guided his helicopter through the familiar corridors of the Cascade Range. 3 years had passed since the Thompson case had dominated local headlines, and the routine patrol flights had long since stopped being searches, becoming instead methodical surveys of timber health and fire prevention. Reed, a former military aviator with calloused hands and eyes the color of storm clouds, had flown these mountains for over a decade, reading their moods like an old lover reads familiar gestures. His co-pilot, Jenny Martinez, adjusted the thermal imaging equipment with practiced precision, her young face illuminated by the green glow of the monitor. At 28, Martinez brought a technical expertise to the Forest Service that complemented Reed's intuitive understanding of the wilderness. She had joined the team 2 years ago, after Lily Thompson had already become another cold case file. But the story of the missing girl had been woven into the oral history of every ranger station from Portland to Bend. The helicopter's rotors carved through the morning air with their familiar rhythmic thunder, sending vibrations through the cockpit that Reed felt in his bones. Below them, the forest stretched in an unbroken carpet of green, punctuated by the silver threads of creeks and the occasional scar of an old logging road. The thermal camera painted the landscape in ghostly shades of blue and purple, revealing the heat signatures of wildlife moving through their ancient pathways. It was Martinez who first noticed the anomaly. Her fingers paused over the controls as a bright orange bloom appeared on the thermal display, isolated and geometric in a way that nature rarely produced. The heat signature pulsed against the cool background of the forest canopy like a beacon, positioned in a section of wilderness so remote that even the most dedicated hikers rarely ventured there. The coordinates placed it nearly 15 miles from the last known sighting of Lily Thompson, deep in a maze of ravines and old-growth timber that had defeated countless search parties. Reed adjusted their flight path with the smooth movements of someone who had navigated these mountains in conditions that would ground lesser pilots. The helicopter banked sharply, its shadow racing across the treetops as they circled the heat source. Through the canopy, Martinez could make out the irregular shape of what appeared to be a structure, its edges softened by 3 years of forest growth but unmistakably human-made. The cabin sat in a natural depression between two ridges, hidden from ground view by a dense screen of Douglas firs and western hemlocks. Someone had chosen this location with deliberate care, understanding how the topology would conceal their presence from casual observation. The structure itself appeared crude but functional, built from materials that would have required considerable effort to transport into such an isolated location. But it was not the cabin that made Martinez's breath catch in her throat. Tethered to a post beside the structure was the unmistakable heat signature of a large dog, its body temperature painting a warm glow against the cold earth. Even through the thermal imaging, they could see the animal's movements were sluggish, suggesting age or poor health. But the creature was undeniably alive. Reed's weathered hands tightened on the controls as the implications of their discovery began to crystallize. In 15 years of flying these mountains, he had encountered abandoned hunting camps, illegal marijuana grows, and the occasional hermit's shelter. But something about this scene felt different. The careful concealment, the remote location, and most disturbing of all, the presence of a living animal suggested a level of ongoing human activity that set every instinct on high alert. Martinez worked frantically to document their find, the camera's mechanical whir mixing with the helicopter's engine noise as she captured image after image. The dog's heat signature showed clear signs of distress, the animal appearing thin and weak, but its survival after years in the wilderness spoke to some form of care or feeding. The revelation sent ice water through Martinez's veins as she remembered the stories the older rangers told about Lily Thompson and her beloved husky. The helicopter circled the site 3 more times, Reed fighting the urge to land immediately, while understanding that protocol demanded they document everything before disturbing the scene. Each pass revealed new details that would later prove crucial to the investigation. A small cleared area near the cabin suggested regular human activity. Heat signatures indicated the presence of what might be a fire pit or cooking area. Most chilling of all, the thermal imaging detected warm areas inside the structure itself, suggesting recent occupation. When Reed finally guided the helicopter back toward the Forest Service station, both crew members sat in stunned silence, processing what they had witnessed. Martinez's hands shook slightly as she reviewed the thermal images on her equipment, each frame confirming what seemed impossible. After 3 years of silence, the forest had finally offered up a clue, but the nature of that clue raised more questions than it answered. The Forest Service station buzzed with controlled urgency as Reed and Martinez presented their findings to Station Chief Robert Hayes. Hayes, a bear of a man with 30 years of mountain experience etched into every line of his face, studied the thermal images with the methodical attention of someone accustomed to making decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. His office, cluttered with topographical maps and radio equipment, became the epicenter of activity as word of the discovery spread through the tight-knit community of forest professionals. Within an hour, Hayes had contacted the Oregon State Police, and Detective James Miller found himself staring at images that would shatter the carefully constructed acceptance he had built around the Thompson case. Miller arrived at the Forest Service station with the grim efficiency of someone pulling on familiar armor. his detectives' instincts awakening from their 3-year hibernation like a predator catching a scent. The thermal images spread across Hayes's desk told a story that challenged everything Miller thought he knew about Lily Thompson's disappearance. The dog's survival suggested either incredible resilience or ongoing human intervention. The cabin's location indicated someone with intimate knowledge of the wilderness and a desire to remain completely hidden. Most disturbing of all, the heat signatures from inside the structure raised the terrifying possibility that they were not looking at an abandoned site, but an active one. Miller's mind raced through the implications as he studied each image. If the dog was indeed Koda, then someone had not only survived in the wilderness for 3 years, but had maintained enough stability to keep an animal alive. The psychological profile of such a person could range from an experienced survivalist to something far more sinister. The detective felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders as he realized that Eleanor Thompson's 3-year nightmare was about to take an unexpected turn. The morning Eleanor Thompson received the call that would shatter her carefully constructed world of waiting. She had been standing at her kitchen sink, mechanically washing the same coffee mug she had used every morning for 3 years. Detective Miller's voice carried across the phone line with a gravity that made her knees weak, each word falling into her consciousness like stones into still water. The thermal images, the cabin, the dog that might be Koda. The information crashed over her in waves that left her gasping for breath she couldn't seem to find. Eleanor's hands trembled as she gripped the kitchen counter, the familiar grain of the wood beneath her fingertips, the only anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. 3 years of forced acceptance, of learning to live with the absence of answers, crumbled in the space of a phone call. The hope she had carefully rationed, doling it out in microscopic doses to sustain herself through the darkest moments, now surged through her system like electricity, both painful and essential. The trek to the cabin required a 2-hour hike through terrain that challenged even experienced wilderness travelers. Eleanor followed Detective Miller and the Forest Service team along game trails and creek beds, her city shoes inadequate for the moss-slicked rocks and fallen logs that blocked their path. Each step took her deeper into a landscape that had haunted her dreams, the forest that had swallowed her daughter whole and now, perhaps, was ready to give something back. Miller carried himself with the focused intensity of a predator, following a scent trail, his eyes constantly scanning the forest floor for signs that might connect this remote location to the original search efforts. The detective had spent sleepless nights over the past 3 years replaying every detail of Lily's disappearance, and now those memories took on new significance as potential clues rather than dead ends. Every broken branch, every disturbed patch of earth became a possible piece of a puzzle he had given up hope of solving. The team moved through the wilderness with the careful deliberation of archaeologists approaching an undisturbed site. Forest Service guides used GPS coordinates to navigate the maze of ravines and ridges, while crime scene technicians carried equipment that would document every aspect of their discovery. Eleanor walked among them like a ghost, her presence both necessary and heartbreaking, the living embodiment of 3 years of unanswered questions. When the cabin finally came into view, tucked into its natural depression between towering Douglas firs, Eleanor felt her breath catch in her chest. The structure was smaller than she had imagined, built from weathered boards and salvaged materials that spoke of desperate resourcefulness rather than careful planning. Moss had begun to claim the roof, and wild vines wound around the support posts, as if the forest was slowly reclaiming what humans had dared to build in its depths. But it was the sight of the dog that broke Eleanor's composure entirely. Koda lay chained to a post beside the cabin, his once magnificent coat now patchy and dull, his blue eyes clouded with age and malnutrition. The husky who had once bounded through Eleanor's house with boundless energy now struggled to lift his head at their approach. But something in his posture suggested recognition, a flicker of memory that connected this broken animal to the puppy who had once stolen Lily's socks and hidden them under her bed. Miller approached the cabin with his weapon drawn, his training overriding the emotional chaos that threatened to overwhelm him. The structure's single door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness beyond the threshold. The detective's movements were methodical, professional, but Eleanor could see the tension in his shoulders, the weight of 3 years of failure driving every careful step. The cabin's interior was a shrine to isolation and obsession. Handmade furniture constructed from forest materials filled the small space. A rough table carved from a single piece of cedar, shelves fashioned from fallen branches, a bed frame lashed together with paracord. But it was the walls that told the real story, covered floor to ceiling with papers, charts, and what appeared to be scientific observations written in a hand that made Eleanor's heart stop beating. Lily's journals filled every available surface, their pages yellowed by humidity and time, but preserved with the care of someone treating sacred texts. The handwriting was unmistakably her daughter's. The careful loops of the letter G, the way she dotted her I's with tiny circles instead of points, the leftward slant that had driven her elementary school teachers to distraction. But these were not the desperate pleas of a captive, or the confused ramblings of someone held against their will. Instead, the pages revealed a meticulous documentation of forest ecology that would have impressed university researchers. Lily had catalogued weather patterns with the precision of a meteorologist, tracked animal migrations with the dedication of a wildlife biologist, and recorded plant growth cycles with an attention to detail that suggested months of careful observation. Her drawings of local flora were executed with scientific accuracy, each specimen labeled with both common and Latin names that demonstrated knowledge far beyond what a 16-year-old should possess. Eleanor's hands shook as she lifted one of the journals, recognizing the notebook she had bought for Lily at the beginning of her junior year. The pages chronicled not the experience of a victim, but the passionate work of someone who believed herself to be engaged in important research. Entries described breakthrough observations and significant behavioral patterns, with an enthusiasm that radiated from every carefully penned word. But scattered throughout the scientific notations were references to someone Lily called simply the Guardian. These mentions appeared with increasing frequency as the journals progressed, describing someone who had opened her eyes to the true importance of the work and helped her understand her unique role in preserving the forest's secrets. The Guardian was portrayed not as a captor but as a mentor, someone who had recognized Lily's potential and guided her toward a higher purpose. Miller read over Eleanor's shoulder, his detective's mind cataloging the psychological implications of what they were discovering. The journals painted a picture of a young woman who had been gradually separated from her previous life, not through force, but through manipulation so subtle and complete that she had come to see her isolation as a privilege rather than a prison. The writing revealed a mind that had been carefully shaped and molded, convinced that her sacrifice was both necessary and noble. As they delved deeper into the journals, a disturbing pattern emerged. The early entries, written in the days immediately following Lily's disappearance, showed confusion and fear, emotions that gradually gave way to acceptance and then enthusiasm. Someone had spent months, perhaps years, reshaping a frightened teenager's perception of reality, until she truly believed she was engaged in vital scientific work, rather than being held captive in a wilderness prison. The transformation documented in those pages was more terrifying than any evidence of physical violence could have been. Miller had seen kidnapping cases before, understood the dynamics of Stockholm Syndrome and psychological manipulation, but the methodical nature of Lily's conversion suggested a predator of unusual sophistication and patience. The Guardian, whoever he was, had not simply taken a victim. He had created a willing participant in her own captivity. Eleanor found herself struggling to reconcile the daughter she remembered with the person revealed in these journals. The Lily who had written these entries was simultaneously her child and a stranger, recognizable in handwriting and mannerisms, but transformed in fundamental ways that made Eleanor question everything she thought she knew about the girl she had raised. The pride evident in Lily's descriptions of her research felt like a betrayal of the grief Eleanor had carried for 3 years. The final entries in the most recent journal were dated just days earlier, suggesting that whoever had maintained this elaborate deception was still active, still nearby. Miller's hand moved instinctively to his radio as the implications of their discovery crystallized. They were not investigating an old crime scene but potentially walking into an active situation. Somewhere in these mountains, the Guardian was waiting, and 3 years of careful planning were about to be disrupted by their arrival. Detective Miller's investigation into the mysterious Guardian began with the methodical precision of a surgeon examining tissue samples. Back at the Havenwood police station, he spread Lily's journals across his desk like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, each entry a fragment of a larger picture that was slowly emerging from the shadows of 3 years of silence. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across pages filled with Lily's careful handwriting. as Miller began the painstaking process of cross-referencing her scientific observations with known faculty at Havenwood High School. The detective's weathered fingers traced through academic records, teacher evaluations, and staff directories, searching for connections that might illuminate the identity of the person who had so completely altered a 16-year-old's perception of reality. Miller had seen psychological manipulation before, but the sophistication evident in Lily's transformation suggested someone with advanced knowledge of adolescent psychology and the particular vulnerabilities that came with teenage ambition and the desperate desire to belong to something larger than oneself. The breakthrough came when Miller noticed that many of Lily's most detailed botanical observations corresponded precisely with the curriculum outline for advanced placement biology at Havenwood High School. The Latin nomenclature, the specific focus on Pacific Northwest ecosystems, and the research methodologies described in her journals all pointed towards someone with formal training in biological sciences. More damning still were subtle phrases and scientific concepts that appeared to be directly lifted from advanced textbooks, suggesting that Lily's mentor had been systematically feeding her information to support the illusion of independent research. Owen Turner's personnel file painted the portrait of an exemplary educator who had spent 15 years molding young minds at Havenwood High School. His photograph showed a man in his early 40s with intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, prematurely gray hair that gave him a distinguished appearance, and the kind of confident smile that parents trusted and students admired. Turner held advanced degrees from prestigious universities, had published papers in respected scientific journals, and had earned Teacher of the Year awards that decorated his classroom walls like trophies. Students consistently rated Turner as their favorite teacher, praising his ability to make complex concepts accessible and his genuine interest in their academic futures. Parent-teacher conferences invariably resulted in glowing reports about Turner's dedication, his willingness to provide extra help during lunch periods, and his talent for identifying and nurturing exceptional students who might otherwise go unnoticed. The man who emerged from these official records was everything a community could want in an educator. But as Miller dug deeper into Turner's background, subtle patterns began to emerge that painted a more troubling picture. Turner had a documented history of forming unusually close relationships with his brightest female students, relationships that school administrators had occasionally questioned but never formally investigated. Several former students had received letters of recommendation from Turner that seemed unusually personal, filled with effusive praise for their character and potential that went beyond typical academic endorsements. The detective discovered that Turner had been instrumental in securing scholarship opportunities for several students over the years, often involving programs that required extended periods away from their families. These success stories had only enhanced Turner's reputation as a teacher who went above and beyond for his students. But Miller began to see them as potential evidence of a pattern of separation and control that had been mistaken for mentorship and dedication. Turner's classroom, when Miller finally gained access to it, revealed the careful cultivation of an environment designed to inspire trust and intellectual excitement. The walls were covered with photographs of former students who had gone on to prestigious universities, their smiling faces serving as testimonials to Turner's effectiveness as an educator. Scientific equipment that went far beyond the school's standard budget suggested someone who invested his own money in creating an atmosphere of serious research and discovery. The detective's trained eye noticed details that would have escaped casual observation. Turner's desk contained multiple copies of university applications and scholarship forms, suggesting someone who made it his business to know every opportunity available to ambitious students. A locked filing cabinet yielded records that Turner had meticulously maintained on his most promising pupils, files that contained far more personal information than any teacher should reasonably possess about their students' family situations, emotional vulnerabilities, and private aspirations. Miller's investigation revealed that Turner had begun paying special attention to Lily Thompson during her sophomore year, when her grades in biology had marked her as exceptionally gifted. Turner had recommended her for advanced independent study programs, had stayed after school to provide additional tutoring, and had gradually positioned himself as the adult who understood and supported her academic ambitions in ways that her single mother, struggling with her own career demands, simply couldn't match. The manipulation had been so subtle and systematic that even Lily's closest friends had initially viewed Turner's attention as a sign of her exceptional ability rather than predatory behavior. Turner had expertly exploited the natural tensions between a bright teenager and her well-meaning but academically limited mother, positioning himself as the intellectual mentor who could guide Lily toward opportunities that Eleanor Thompson couldn't even comprehend, much less provide. School security footage, painstakingly reviewed by Miller and his team, showed the gradual progression of Turner's influence over Lily. Early recordings captured brief after-school conversations that appeared entirely appropriate. But as months passed, the interactions became longer, more private, and increasingly took place in Turner's classroom rather than public areas of the school. The body language in these recordings told a story of a vulnerable teenager being slowly isolated from her peer group and drawn into an exclusive relationship with an authority figure who made her feel uniquely special and understood. The detective's most chilling discovery came in the form of emails recovered from Turner's school account, messages that had been carefully crafted to appear supportive while systematically undermining Lily's confidence in everyone except her biology teacher. Turner had responded to Lily's doubts about her academic future with reassurances that positioned him as her only true advocate, the one person who recognized her potential and was willing to help her achieve greatness that others couldn't see. Miller found evidence that Turner had been gradually preparing Lily for separation from her normal life, long before her actual disappearance. The teacher had suggested that truly dedicated students sometimes needed to make sacrifices that others wouldn't understand, that groundbreaking research required isolation from the distractions of ordinary teenage concerns. He had filled her head with stories of young scientists who had achieved breakthrough discoveries by abandoning conventional paths and embracing opportunities that seemed unusual to those with limited vision. The psychological profile that emerged from Miller's investigation revealed a predator of exceptional cunning, someone who had weaponized education and mentorship to gain complete control over a vulnerable teenager's sense of identity and purpose. Turner had not simply kidnapped Lily Thompson. He had convinced her that leaving her old life behind was her own choice, a brave decision that marked her as special among her peers. The detective's hands trembled with barely controlled rage as he compiled evidence of how Turner had exploited every aspect of Lily's personality: her intelligence, her ambition, her desire to make her mother proud, her fear of being ordinary, to create a prison constructed from her own dreams and aspirations. The man who had been trusted with shaping young minds had instead twisted one of them into a shape that served his own dark purposes. The pre-dawn darkness clung to the Cascade Mountains like a shroud as the tactical team assembled at the Forest Service staging area, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air. Detective Miller stood among the officers, his weathered face etched with the grim determination of someone who had waited 3 years for this moment. The weight of his service weapon felt heavier than usual against his hip, a reminder that the man they were hunting had proven himself capable of psychological manipulation so complete that his victim had become his willing accomplice. Eleanor Thompson sat in the passenger seat of Miller's unmarked vehicle, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white as bone. Against all protocols and professional judgment, Miller had agreed to let her accompany the team to a secure perimeter position. The detective understood that no force on earth could keep a mother away from the moment when 3 years of agonizing uncertainty might finally find resolution. Eleanor's eyes held the hollow intensity of someone who had already died 1,000 deaths in her imagination, someone for whom the approaching confrontation represented either salvation or the final destruction of hope. The forest in the hour before dawn was a cathedral of shadows and whispered sounds. Ancient Douglas firs rose like pillars toward a sky that showed only the faintest hint of approaching light, their massive trunks disappearing into darkness that seemed to swallow the tactical team's flashlight beams. The air carried the scent of moss and decomposing leaves, the rich perfume of a wilderness that had witnessed countless secrets and now prepared to surrender one of its darkest. Miller's radio crackled with the subdued communications of officers positioning themselves around the cabin's perimeter. Each team member moved with the careful precision of hunters stalking dangerous prey, understanding that Owen Turner had demonstrated a level of psychological sophistication that made him potentially unpredictable when cornered. The teacher who had spent years crafting elaborate deceptions might have contingency plans that none of them could anticipate. The cabin sat in its natural depression, like a tumor in the forest's flesh, its weathered walls now surrounded by law enforcement officers who had spent hours hiking through terrain that challenged even experienced wilderness travelers. Through night vision equipment, they could see smoke rising from the structure's crude chimney, evidence that Turner was indeed present and had maintained his wilderness prison throughout the long years of Lily's captivity. Eleanor remained at the designated safe position, nearly a quarter-mile from the cabin, but close enough to hear the distant sounds of the operation unfolding. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such violence that she feared it might betray their location to anyone listening in the darkness. 3 years of carefully managed grief had given way to a primal fury that threatened to consume what remained of her sanity. The mother who had spent countless nights imagining her daughter's suffering now faced the possibility of confronting the man responsible for stealing her child's life. The first sign of Turner's presence came when a figure emerged from the cabin's doorway, silhouetted against the warm glow of lamplight from within. Even at a distance, Miller recognized the confident posture of a man who had spent his career commanding classroom attention, someone accustomed to being the center of intellectual discourse. Turner moved with the unhurried grace of someone who felt completely secure in his domain, unaware that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse around him. Owen Turner appeared exactly as his personnel photographs had suggested. A distinguished man in his early 40s, whose wire-rimmed glasses and prematurely gray hair gave him an air of academic authority that parents trusted and students admired. His flannel shirt and hiking boots suggested someone who had adapted to wilderness living while maintaining the fundamental appearance of respectability that had made him such an effective predator. Even in these circumstances, Turner radiated the kind of intellectual confidence that had allowed him to manipulate a vulnerable teenager into believing that isolation was a privilege. Miller's voice carried across the forest clearing with the authority of 15 years in law enforcement, ordering Turner to step away from the cabin with his hands visible. The teacher's response was not the panic or desperation that might have been expected from someone whose crimes had finally been discovered. Instead, Turner moved with deliberate calm, his body language suggesting someone who had anticipated this moment and prepared for it with the same meticulous planning that had characterized his manipulation of Lily Thompson. The confrontation that followed unfolded with the surreal quality of a nightmare made manifest. Turner stood in the clearing before his wilderness prison, surrounded by armed officers, yet somehow managed to project an aura of moral superiority that was both infuriating and deeply unsettling. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried the same measured cadence that had made him such an effective teacher, the tone of someone explaining complex concepts to those too limited to understand their significance without guidance. Turner's explanation of his actions revealed the complete absence of remorse or recognition that he had committed any crime. In his distorted worldview, he had rescued Lily Thompson from a life of mediocrity, had recognized her exceptional potential, and provided her with opportunities for growth and discovery that her conventional upbringing could never have offered. He spoke of the project with the fervor of someone describing a religious mission, his eyes bright with the fanatic certainty of someone who had convinced himself that his crimes were actually acts of benevolence. The teacher detailed how he had gradually separated Lily from the influences that were holding her back: her well-meaning but intellectually limited mother, her peers who couldn't appreciate her gifts, the social expectations that would have trapped her in ordinary ambitions. Turner described the wilderness isolation as a laboratory where Lily's true potential could flourish without the contamination of conventional thinking. He had given her the opportunity to engage in pure research, to make discoveries that would have been impossible within the constraints of traditional education. Eleanor, listening to Turner's justifications through Miller's radio transmission, felt something fundamental break apart inside her chest. The casual way this man dismissed her role in her daughter's life, the complete absence of acknowledgement that he had stolen 3 years from both of them, ignited a rage so pure and consuming that it threatened to burn away everything else she had ever felt. The grief that had sustained her through years of uncertainty transformed into something harder and more dangerous, a fury that demanded justice for crimes that went far beyond simple kidnapping. Turner's most chilling revelation came when he assured the officers that Lily was safe, that she understood the importance of their work together, and that she would be distressed to learn that her mother had sent police to disrupt their research. He spoke of Lily as a willing collaborator rather than a victim, someone who had embraced the opportunity he had provided and had thrived under his guidance. The complete absence of recognition that he had psychologically manipulated a child revealed the depth of his delusion and the sophistication of his self-justification. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath as Turner continued his explanation, the ancient trees bearing witness to words that revealed the true horror of what had been done to Lily Thompson. This was not a simple case of kidnapping or even Stockholm Syndrome, but something far more insidious. the complete reconstruction of a young woman's sense of identity and purpose, accomplished with such skill that she had become a willing participant in her own captivity. Miller's hands trembled with barely controlled rage as he listened to Turner's casual dismissal of the pain he had caused, the lives he had destroyed, the trust he had betrayed. The detective had seen many criminals attempt to justify their actions, but Turner's complete inability to recognize the magnitude of his crimes represented a level of narcissistic delusion that was both professionally fascinating and personally enraging. This was a man who had weaponized his position of authority and trust to satisfy his own psychological needs while convincing himself that he was performing a service. The moment Lily Thompson first laid eyes on her daughter, after 3 years of agonizing uncertainty, the world seemed to fracture along invisible fault lines. Lily emerged from the cabin's interior, with the slow, measured steps of someone disturbed from important work rather than rescued from captivity. At 19, she had grown taller, her once round teenage face now angular and defined by the harsh realities of wilderness living. Her dark hair, which Eleanor remembered as always perfectly brushed and styled, now hung in a simple braid down her back, practical and unadorned. But it was Lily's eyes that delivered the most devastating blow to Eleanor's heart. They held no recognition, no relief, no joy at seeing her mother, only the cool, analytical gaze of someone examining an unwelcome interruption. Eleanor's legs threatened to buckle beneath her as she took in the sight of her daughter, alive but fundamentally changed. The girl who had disappeared 3 years ago had been replaced by a young woman whose posture and demeanor spoke of someone who had found purpose and identity in isolation. Lily wore simple clothing, a flannel shirt too large for her frame, sturdy hiking boots that had seen considerable use, and the focused expression of someone deeply committed to work that others couldn't possibly understand. The transformation was so complete that Eleanor wondered if she was looking at a stranger who merely resembled the daughter she had lost. The cabin's interior, when the search team finally gained access, revealed the true scope of Turner's psychological manipulation. Every surface bore evidence of what appeared to be genuine scientific research: meticulously organized specimens, detailed charts tracking seasonal changes, and observation logs that demonstrated years of careful documentation. Lily had created a workspace that would have impressed university researchers, her dedication to the project evident in every carefully labeled sample and precisely recorded measurement. The quality of her work was undeniable, but the isolation required to produce it represented a theft of her young adulthood that no academic achievement could justify. Lily's reaction to the arrival of law enforcement and her mother defied every expectation Eleanor had nurtured during 3 years of imagining this moment. Instead of running into her mother's arms or expressing gratitude for her rescue, Lily displayed visible frustration and confusion at the interruption of her routine. She moved protectively around her research materials, her body language suggesting someone guarding precious work from those too ignorant to appreciate its significance. Her voice, when she finally spoke, carried the measured cadence of Turner's classroom instruction, as if she had internalized not just his words, but his very manner of speaking. The young woman who had once shared her every thought with her mother now spoke in the clinical language of scientific research, describing her work with a passion that would have been admirable under any other circumstances. Lily detailed her observations of local wildlife populations, her documentation of plant species adaptation to climate variations, and her theories about ecosystem interconnectedness with the fervor of someone presenting a doctoral thesis. Every word demonstrated the depth of her knowledge and the sincerity of her commitment, making the reality of her situation even more heartbreaking for those who understood what had really been taken from her. Eleanor watched in horrified fascination as her daughter defended Turner against the accusations being leveled against him. Lily spoke of her former teacher not as a captor but as a mentor who had recognized her potential when no one else would, who had provided her with opportunities for growth and discovery that conventional education could never have offered. She described their relationship as a collaboration between equals, dismissing any suggestion that she had been manipulated or coerced into her current situation. The complete absence of victim mentality was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of her presentation, revealing how thoroughly Turner had reconstructed her understanding of their relationship. Detective Miller observed Lily's behavior with the clinical eye of someone who had studied psychological manipulation in its most extreme forms. The young woman displayed classic symptoms of Stockholm Syndrome, but with a sophistication that spoke to Turner's skill as a predator. Lily had not simply bonded with her captor out of survival necessity. She had been convinced that her captivity represented the highest form of educational opportunity, a privilege that separated her from the ordinary masses who couldn't appreciate the significance of her work. The most chilling aspect of Lily's transformation became apparent as she insisted on showing the search team her research achievements. She moved through her organized workspace with the pride of someone displaying a life's work, pointing out particularly significant discoveries and explaining the implications of her findings with infectious enthusiasm. Her dedication was genuine, her knowledge impressive, but the cost of achieving such focus had been the complete sacrifice of her connection to the normal world of relationships, family, and age-appropriate experiences. Lily's notebooks revealed the gradual progression of her psychological captivity, in ways that were more disturbing than any physical evidence of coercion could have been. The early entries showed a frightened teenager gradually accepting Turner's explanations for their isolation, his assurances that their work was too important to be contaminated by outside interference. As months passed, the entries reflected increasing enthusiasm for the project and decreasing references to her previous life, as if Eleanor and her former friends had simply faded from memory like half-remembered dreams. The young woman's reaction to her mother's tears was perhaps the most devastating moment of the entire rescue operation. Lily observed Eleanor's emotional breakdown with the detached curiosity of a scientist, studying an interesting but irrelevant phenomenon. She seemed genuinely puzzled by her mother's distress, unable to understand why someone would be upset about an arrangement that had clearly benefited everyone involved. Her inability to recognize the pain she had caused revealed how completely Turner had severed her emotional connections to her previous life. Eleanor found herself facing a daughter who was simultaneously everything she had hoped for and nothing she recognized. Lily had become an accomplished researcher, a young woman of impressive knowledge and dedication. But she had achieved these things at the cost of her humanity, her connection to family, and her understanding of normal human relationships. The girl who had once called her mother every day after school now looked at Eleanor as if she were a stranger whose emotional reactions were both incomprehensible and slightly annoying. The psychological damage Turner had inflicted on Lily became more apparent as the hours passed. The young woman displayed no understanding of the passage of time, speaking of her 3 years of isolation as if they had been a few intense months of productive work. She had no awareness of what she had missed. Graduations, college applications, first relationships, the normal experiences that mark the transition from adolescence to adulthood. Turner had stolen not just her freedom, but her awareness of what freedom meant. Medical personnel who examined Lily found her to be in good physical health, well-nourished and fit from years of outdoor living. But her psychological state revealed the true extent of Turner's crimes. She displayed no signs of depression or anxiety about her situation, instead exhibiting the focused intensity of someone completely absorbed in meaningful work. Her inability to recognize anything abnormal about her circumstances demonstrated how thoroughly Turner had altered her perception of reality. As the rescue team prepared to transport Lily away from the cabin that had been her prison for 3 years, she displayed genuine distress for the first time since their arrival. Her concern was not about leaving Turner or losing her freedom, but about abandoning her research before it was complete. She begged to be allowed to finish cataloging her observations, to properly preserve her specimens, to ensure that the important work she had been doing would not be lost to those too ignorant to continue it. Her priorities revealed the complete success of Turner's manipulation, showing how he had convinced her that scientific achievement was more valuable than human connection. The sterile corridors of Havenwood Medical Center echoed with the quiet efficiency of a place designed for healing. But Lily Thompson walked through them with the weighted steps of someone who understood that some wounds ran deeper than medicine could easily reach. 3 weeks had passed since Owen Turner's arrest. 3 weeks since Lily had been physically rescued from the wilderness cabin. Yet the psychological captivity that had held her mind prisoner for 3 years proved far more resistant to liberation than anyone had anticipated. Eleanor's own transformation during those weeks had been as dramatic as any physical rehabilitation. The woman who had spent years in the limbo of not knowing had been replaced by someone facing the brutal reality of partial answers. She had gained back her daughter's physical presence, but lost the illusion that rescue would mean a return to their previous life. The Lily who sat in therapy sessions and medical evaluations was simultaneously her child and a stranger, recognizable in features but foreign in fundamental ways that made every interaction feel like navigating a minefield of hope and heartbreak. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the specialist in trauma psychology who had been assigned to Lily's case, explained the complexities of deprogramming someone who had been subjected to such sophisticated manipulation. Her office, decorated with calming earth tones and carefully chosen artwork, became a sanctuary where Eleanor learned the clinical terms for what Turner had done to her daughter's mind. Stockholm Syndrome, psychological conditioning, trauma bonding. Each phrase represented another layer of damage that would require patience, skill, and time to address. The early therapy sessions revealed the full extent of Turner's psychological architecture. Lily would sit in the comfortable chair across from Dr. Martinez, with the posture of someone attending an academic conference, rather than receiving treatment for severe psychological trauma. She spoke of her research with unwavering passion, describing Turner not as a captor, but as a mentor who had recognized her unique potential when others had failed to see it. Her voice carried the measured cadence of someone presenting scientific findings, emotionally detached from the personal implications of her own words. Eleanor observed these sessions from behind a one-way mirror, her heart breaking anew each time her daughter defended the man who had stolen her adolescence. Lily's inability to recognize Turner's manipulation as abuse demonstrated the sophistication of his psychological control. He had not simply isolated her physically, he had convinced her that isolation was a privilege, that their work together represented a higher form of existence than the mundane concerns of ordinary people who couldn't appreciate the significance of their research. The breakthrough moments came in fragments, scattered across weeks of careful therapeutic work. Dr. Martinez used techniques designed to help Lily examine her memories without triggering the defensive mechanisms Turner had instilled in her. The process was painstakingly slow, requiring the therapist to challenge deeply held beliefs without activating the psychological barriers that Turner had constructed to protect his influence over Lily's thinking. One autumn afternoon, 6 weeks after her rescue, Lily experienced her first moment of genuine doubt about Turner's motivations. She had been describing a particularly meaningful conversation with her former teacher when something in Dr. Martinez's carefully neutral response triggered a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For just an instant, the confident researcher facade cracked, revealing the confused and frightened teenager who had been buried beneath years of psychological conditioning. Eleanor witnessed this moment of breakthrough from her usual position behind the observation window, her hands pressed against the glass as if she could physically reach through to comfort her daughter. The sight of genuine emotion breaking through Lily's clinical detachment was both hopeful and heartbreaking, a reminder of the person her daughter had been before Turner's influence had reshaped her understanding of reality. The process of helping Lily reconnect with suppressed memories of her previous life proved both essential and agonizing. Dr. Martinez used photographs from Lily's childhood and adolescence, carefully selected moments that predated Turner's influence, to help trigger authentic emotional responses that bypassed the psychological barriers he had constructed. Each recovered memory represented a small victory in the battle for Lily's authentic self, but also a reminder of how much had been lost during her years of captivity. Lily's gradual recognition of the time that had been stolen from her came in waves of grief that were devastating to witness. The young woman who had confidently described 3 years of wilderness research as the most meaningful period of her life began to understand that those same years had cost her graduation from high school, college applications, first relationships, and countless small moments that marked the normal progression from adolescence to adulthood. The mathematical precision with which she had once cataloged forest ecosystems became a tool for calculating the magnitude of her loss. Eleanor's own healing journey ran parallel to her daughter's, requiring her to confront not just the trauma of Lily's disappearance, but the complex emotions surrounding her return. The mother who had spent 3 years mourning a lost daughter now faced the challenge of accepting the changed person who had taken her place. Love alone could not bridge the gap that Turner's manipulation had created, requiring instead a patient rebuilding of trust and connection that had been severed by years of enforced separation. The first genuine conversation between mother and daughter came nearly 2 months after Lily's rescue, triggered by Eleanor's discovery of a small wooden carving that Lily had made during her time in the wilderness. The intricate piece depicted a family of deer, carved with the skill of someone who had spent countless hours observing wildlife behavior. As Eleanor held the carving, something in her expression of wonder and pride pierced through Lily's emotional barriers, allowing her to see her mother not as an obstacle to important work, but as someone who had never stopped loving her. Winter arrived early in Havenwood that year, blanketing the town in snow that muffled the sounds of daily life and created a sense of quiet introspection that seemed to mirror the healing process taking place within the Thompson household. Eleanor had transformed Lily's childhood bedroom into a space that honored both who her daughter had been and who she was becoming, displaying her wilderness research alongside childhood photographs and academic awards from before Turner's influence. The legal proceedings against Owen Turner provided a structure for Lily's growing understanding of what had been done to her. As she testified about her experiences, guided by prosecutors who understood the delicate nature of her psychological state, Lily began to see her story through the eyes of others who recognized Turner's actions as crimes rather than acts of mentorship. The process was painful but necessary, allowing her to externalize experiences that she had internalized as normal and beneficial. Turner's sentencing hearing became a watershed moment in Lily's recovery. Watching the man who had controlled her thoughts and emotions for 3 years being led away in shackles helped her understand the reality of her situation in ways that months of therapy had struggled to achieve. The respect and authority she had attributed to Turner crumbled as she saw him revealed as what he truly was: a predator who had exploited her trust and manipulated her vulnerability for his own psychological gratification. The healing process was not linear, marked by setbacks that tested both Lily's resilience and Eleanor's patience. There were days when Turner's psychological conditioning reasserted itself, when Lily would speak longingly of returning to her research or express frustration with the limitations of her current life. These moments served as reminders that psychological captivity could be more enduring than physical imprisonment, requiring constant vigilance to prevent relapse into familiar patterns of thinking. Spring brought new growth to Havenwood's landscape and tentative signs of healing to the Thompson family. Lily began attending community college classes, slowly rebuilding the academic identity that Turner had hijacked for his own purposes. Her intelligence and dedication remained intact, but she was learning to apply them in service of her own goals, rather than as validation for someone else's twisted vision of mentorship and control. The evening Eleanor realized that her daughter was truly coming home to herself was marked not by dramatic revelations, but by a quiet moment of shared silence. They sat together on the front porch where Lily had once played as a child, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. For the first time since her rescue, Lily looked at her mother and saw not a stranger who had interrupted important work, but the woman who had never stopped hoping for her return. Eleanor reached for her daughter's hand, feeling the calluses that years of wilderness living had left on her palms, but also sensing the warmth of genuine connection that had been absent for so long. Lily's fingers intertwined with her mother's, a small gesture that represented a victory more meaningful than any academic achievement or research breakthrough. The silence between them was no longer empty, but full of possibility, carrying the promise that while the scars of manipulation would always remain, they need not define the future that mother and daughter would build together. We want to hear your opinion about this thrilling story. What do you think will happen with them? Tell us your name, where you are watching from. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new stories coming up. See you next time.